Which public figures have been insulted, airbrushed, or shortchanged by history? The many criteria we might use to assess this can vary wildly, as history, said to be written by the victors, is an ongoing, evolving process of learning that can change everything we know. Look at Richard III's skeleton and the DNA findings of Cheddar Man. There are doubtless hundreds of examples from Britain and around the world, but here are mine. Richard III is known today as the murderer of his two nephews. He was King of England from June 1483 until his death at the Battle of Bosworth against Henry Tudor in August 1485. He was the last king of the House of York and the last of the Plantagenet dynasty. When his elder brother, King Edward IV, died unexpectedly in April 1483, his will named Richard as Lord Protector of the realm for Edward's eldest son and successor, the 12-year-old Edward V. Arrangements were made for Edward's coronation on the 22nd of June 1483, but before the king could be crowned, the marriage of his parents was declared bigamous and therefore invalid. On the 25th of June, an assembly of lords and commoners proclaimed Richard as the rightful king, and he was crowned on the 6th of July 1483. Prince Edward and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, called the Princes in the Tower, were under close guard inside the tower and were not seen in public after August. Accusations circulated that they had been murdered on Richard's orders. Strangely, nobody close to the doomed boys, not even their own grieving mother, Elizabeth Woodville, who hated Richard and had murdered her brother, accused him of the deed. The only others who could have got anywhere near the boys were his henchmen, the Duke of Buckingham, and the Tudor factions, perhaps Margaret Beaufort, the super-ambitious mother of Henry Tudor, later Henry VII, for whom she would have done anything. Under the Tudor monarchs, where surviving strands of the House of York still posed a major threat to their rule, Richard's memory and even his physical image was forever blackened by Sir Thomas More and Shakespeare. Richard's naked body was thought to have been thrown into a river and long since lost, but in 2012, an archaeological excavation was commissioned by Philippa Langley with the assistance of the Richard III Society on the site previously occupied by Greyfriars Priory. The University of Leicester identified the skeleton found in the excavation as that of Richard as a result of radiocarbon dating. This was compared with contemporary reports of his appearance, identification of trauma sustained at the battle, and comparison with his mitochondrial DNA with that of two matrilineal descendants of his sister, Anne. He was reburied in Leicester Cathedral on the 26th of March 2015. But did Richard really kill those boys? Nikola Tesla was a man for whom the word genius is not overstated. Tesla was a Serbian-American inventor, electrical engineer, mechanical engineer and futurist born in 1856, best known for his contributions to the design of the modern alternating current AC electricity supply system. In 1884 he emigrated to the United States, where he became a naturalized citizen. With the help of partners to finance and market his ideas, Tesla set up laboratories and companies in New York to develop a range of electrical and mechanical devices. Attempting to develop inventions he could patent and market, Tesla conducted a range of experiments with mechanical oscillators, generators, electrical discharge tubes, and early X-ray imaging. He also built a wirelessly controlled boat, one of the first ever exhibited. Tesla became well known as an inventor and demonstrated his achievements to celebrities and wealthy patrons at his lab, and was noted for his showmanship at public lectures. Throughout the 1890s, Tesla pursued his ideas for wireless lighting and worldwide wireless electric power distribution. In 1893, he made pronouncements on the possibility of wireless communication with his devices, i.e., mobile phones as we understand them today. In his words, It will soon be possible to transmit wireless messages around the world so simply that any individual can carry and operate his own apparatus. If only Tesla had had more funding from wealthy sponsors, his brilliant and oddly prophetic inventions and theories, i.e. the Wi-Fi, the mobile phone, free energy, ozone generators, unlimited electricity, thought machines, the world today might have been very different. Tesla himself confidently announced, "Electric power is everywhere present in unlimited quantities and can drive the world's machinery without the need of coal, oil, gas, or any of the other common fuels." And no free energy device will ever be allowed to reach the market. On the 7th of January 1943, at the ripe old age of 86, Tesla died of coronary thrombosis, alone and penniless in a New York hotel. The FBI soon raided the hotel and took away his files and invention notes. Maybe his pioneering work threatened the avaricious profits of the multi-billion-dollar oil, gas, and technology tycoons. King Edward II was born in 1284. He was the youngest of 14 children by the mighty English King Edward I, Hammer of the Scots, and his first wife Eleanor of Castile. The year following his father's death in 1307, he married Isabella of France, the daughter of the powerful King Philip IV, as part of a long-running effort to resolve the tensions between the English and the French. Edward grew up to be tall and muscular and was considered good-looking by the standards of the period. He had a reputation as a competent public speaker and was known for his generosity to household staff. He was a good horseman, and in his letters he shows a quirky sense of humour, joking about sending unsatisfactory animals to his friends, such as horses who disliked carrying their riders, or lazy hunting dogs too slow to catch rabbits. He was not particularly interested in hunting or falconry, both popular activities of the day. Unusually, he enjoyed rowing, as well as hedging and ditching, and enjoyed associating with labourers and other low-class workers. This behaviour was not considered normal for the nobility of the period and attracted much criticism. In the spring of 1301, his father declared Edward the Prince of Wales, granting him the earldom of Chester and lands across North Wales. He seems to have hoped that this would help pacify the region and that it would give his son some financial independence, as the two had argued about money many times before. The Scottish conflict flared up once again in 1306, when Robert the Bruce killed his rival John Comyn and declared himself the King of the Scots. Edward mobilised a fresh army, but as he was in ailing health, his son Edward would formally be in charge of the expedition. It's not clear what role Prince Edward's forces played in the campaign that summer, which, under the orders of Edward I, saw a punitive, brutal retaliation against Bruce's faction in Scotland. Edward had a close and controversial relationship with Piers Gaveston, the son of one of the king's household knights, who had joined his household in 1300. The precise nature of Edward and Gaveston's relationship is uncertain. They may have been lovers, friends, or sworn brothers. However, Gaveston's arrogance and power as Edward's favourite provoked discontent both among the barons and the French royal family, and Edward was forced to exile him. Upon Gaveston's return, the barons pressured the king into agreeing to wide-ranging reforms called the Ordinances of 1311. And with these new powers, the barons banished Gaveston again, to which Edward responded by revoking the reforms and recalling his favourite. In 1312, Edward's cousin, the Earl of Lancaster, led a group of the barons, seized and executed Gaveston, sparking off several years of armed confrontation. Homosexuality was fiercely condemned by the Church in the 14th century England, which equated it with heresy, but engaging in sex with another man did not necessarily define an individual's personal identity in the same way it might in the 21st. After all, Richard the Lionheart, before coming king, had caused similar gossip. There is one contemporary document concerning his relationship with King Philip II of France. In 1187, a chronicle reported that Richard, then Duke of Aquitaine, the son of the King of England, remained with Philip, the King of France, who so honoured him for so long that they ate every day at the same table and from the same dish, and at night their beds did not separate them. And the King of France loved him as his own soul, and they loved each other so much that the King of England was absolutely astonished at the passionate love between them. Also, both Edward and Gaveston had sexual relationships with their wives who bore them children. Edward also had an illegitimate son and may have had an affair with his niece, Eleanor de Clare. The contemporary evidence supporting their sexual relationship comes primarily from an anonymous chronicler in the 1320s who described how Edward felt such love for Gaveston that he entered into a covenant of constancy and bound himself with him before all other mortals with a bond of indissoluble love, firmly drawn up and fastened with a knot. The first specimen suggestion that Edward engaged in sex with men was recorded in 1334 when Adam Allerton, the Bishop of Winchester, was accused of having stated in 1326 that Edward was a sodomite. The Moe Chronicle from the 1390s simply notes that Edward gave himself too much to the vice of sodomy. Allegations were at least part politically motivated and are the very similar ones to the highly politicised sodomy allegations made against the secretive order of the Knights Templar in 1308. Strangely though, neither the contemporary church, Edward's own father, nor his father-in-law, the King of France, appear to have made any adverse comments about Edward's sexual behaviour. After the disastrous English defeat by Robert the Bruce at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, English forces were pushed back in Scotland. Widespread famine followed, and criticism of the king's reign mounted. Edward finally signed a truce with Robert, which angered the English nobles and army, especially those who had spilt blood for his mighty father and namesake. Opposition to the regime grew, and when Isabella was sent to France to negotiate a peace treaty in 1325, she turned against Edward and refused to return. Isabella then allied herself with her lover, the exiled Roger Mortimer, and invaded England with a small army the year after. Edward's regime collapsed and he fled into Wales, where he was captured in November. Forced to relinquish his crown in January 1327 in favour of his son, Edward III, and he died in Berkeley Castle on the 21st of September, probably murdered on the orders of the new regime. Most historians agree that Edward did die at Berkeley on that date, although there is a minority view that he was secretly released and died much later. Accounts began to circulate that Edward had been killed by the insertion of a red-hot poker into his anus, and horrific screams had been heard in nearby houses. Possibly this was as a result of deliberate propaganda. Chroniclers in the mid-1330s and 1340s spread this account further, supported in later years by Geoffrey Le Baker's colourful account of the killing. It became incorporated into most later stories of Edward, typically being linked to his possible homosexuality. Most historians now dismiss this account of Edward's death, querying the logic of his captors murdering him in such an easily detectable fashion. But the corpses in suspicious royal deaths were always examined to see if there were telltale marks on the body. The historian Ian Mortimer suggests that the story in Italian priest Manuel Fieschi's letter, i.e. that Edward escaped Berkeley Castle in 1327 with the help of a servant and ultimately retired to become a hermit abroad, is broadly accurate, but argues that it was in fact Mortimer and Isabella who had Edward secretly released, who then faked his death. Even Edward's own son and mighty successor, Edward III, insisted that this was the case. King Harold Godwinson was born in 1022 to the powerful Earl Godwin of Wessex and his Danish wife, Githa. He had 7 siblings, including 4 brothers, 3 of whom would also die violently in the battles of 1066. His sisters would become nuns except one, the beautiful and well-educated Edith, who was married to King Edward the Confessor. Harold became Earl of East Anglia in 1043, and he began a relationship with Edith Swanneck, who appears to have been heiress to lands in Cambridgeshire, Suffolk and Essex, by whom he had 7 children. He was described in the primary sources as popular and affable, gaining the reputation of being a capable warrior and a loyal ambassador for King Edward. Never once did he rebel or plot against the king. In 1064 or 5, Earl Harold seems to have undertaken a personal mission to mainland Europe, although we don't know why. But a storm shipwrecked him and his entourage on the coast of Ponthieu, where the local count, Guy, was soon overawed by the mighty Duke William of neighbouring Normandy and handed Harold over to his hospitality. Harold and his party were, in effect, prisoners. William had seized his golden chance to wring the most out of England's most powerful and wealthy earl. Back in 1051, William had visited his distant kinsman in England, King Edward the Confessor, whose mother was Emma of Normandy, William's own great-aunt, who had supposedly promised the English crown to the young duke if he and Edith didn't sire issue of their own. They never did. So now William had his golden opportunity to press his advantage. A sacred oath was sworn, although the Normans could never decide where. It was sworn over hidden sacred relics, the Normans admitted later, and once the wily duke was satisfied he had trapped his man, Harold was allowed to sail home unharmed. Harold, back in England, dismissed this oath, and the Witan, a council of England's most powerful nobles and clerics, did likewise. Only they and the king could decide the succession, and only in England. This alleged oath was enforced under duress and in captivity. Any sworn oath that needed to be done with hidden sacred relics was surely invalid. But the damage was done. The Normans were now seriously expecting their duke to eventually become king in England. After the death of the aging Edward, in January 1066, the powerful Witan instead elected Harold as king. Little is known about his short reign other than the kingdom was under dire threat of invasion by the Normans as well as the Danes and the Norse, to both of whom the fickle Edward had promised his crown well before he had done to Duke William. Harold reigned for 9 hectic months in 1066 until his death at the excessively violent Battle of Hastings in October against Duke William's Norman army that fateful year. So bloody had been the battle that in 1070 the Pope imposed a penance upon the Norman conquerors who had shed Christian blood at the battle. The Normans now ruled England, and their propaganda machine went into overdrive. Now, any mention of Harold as king was airbrushed out. Direct links between Edward and William were exaggerated, and the popular Harold suddenly became known to history as a usurper. Captain William Bligh of the Mutiny on the Bounty. In contradiction to the populist idea that Captain Bligh was a monster and his subordinate Fletcher Christian was a hero, the story, according to letters found by those actually involved, changed the narrative. Bligh's naval career, which began in 1761 as a ship's boy, involved various appointments and assignments. First rose to prominence as master of HMS Resolution under Captain James Cook, from whom Bligh received praise for his navigation skills. Bligh also served on 3 of the same ships on which Fletcher Christian also served simultaneously in his naval career. So the two did know each other previously. After the mutiny in 1789, many of Christian's family and friends sought to blacken Bligh's name during the trials in England of the captured mutineers. Bligh was absent commanding a second breadfruit expedition during this time. One of his men was well connected, and another, who had been flogged aboard, contacted Christian's older brother, a lawyer back in England. Yet, compared to most Royal Navy captains of the time, Bligh was actually quite lenient and relatively humane with his crew, most of whom had venereal diseases according to the ship's logs. This included Christian, according to the records. The first flogging occurred after 77 days into the Bounty's mission to Tahiti. This was for contempt and insolence. Only 229 lashes were meted out on the entire voyage. He was uncommonly concerned with the physical health of his men, and contrary to popular misconceptions, he was slow to impose corporal punishment. And Bligh ordered a humane 3-shift rotation system of 8 hours each, as opposed to the usual 4-hour sleep on most Royal Navy ships at the time. He also offered crews porridge each morning. Like many of today's corporate executives, he almost, but not quite, reached the pinnacle of his profession, having been honourably acquitted in 1790 of losing the HMS Bounty to the mutineers. But he could and did dish out fearful tongue lashings, and his temper was legendary. These were not traits that would endear him to the violent, street-smart members of the lower classes who made up the bulk of the crews over which he served. Bligh also doubled up as the ship's purser, accounting for the stock-taking of food. These men were always suspected of corruption, making money on the side, and so they were despised by crews. Bligh later became governor of New South Wales in Australia, where he made enemies amongst even his own officer class. He was overthrown by military officers in a coup d'etat against his rule for suppressing the smuggling of rum. He was their captive for 2 years before being rescued by British forces from the homeland. He went on to captain a Royal Navy warship under Admiral Nelson at the Battle of Copenhagen in 1801. The mutiny story was soon long forgotten and became entrenched in myth until the old story was unearthed in the 20th century by Hollywood, was rewritten and enhanced for effect. Ethelred the Unready was born in 966 to King Edgar and Queen Ethelred. He was king of the English from 978 to 1013 and again from 1014 until his death in 1016. His epithet does not derive from the modern word unready, but rather the Old English unred, meaning evil counsel. This is a cruel pun on his name, which means good counsel. Ethelred came to the throne aged 12 in 978 after the murder of his older half-brother, Edward the Martyr, of which his own mother is suspected of ordering the deed. The chief problem of Ethelred's reign was conflict with the Danish Vikings. After several decades of relative peace, and hearing that there is now a boy king on the throne, Danish raids on English territory began again in earnest in the 980s, becoming markedly more serious and violent in the early 990s, with the highly devastating assaults in 1006-7 and 1009-12. Ethelred's poor planning and sheer bad luck saw to it that the English armies rarely ever faced or stopped the Vikings, always being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Though there were heroic English victories during these violent campaigns, such as the Battle of Thetford in 1004 and the lifting of various Viking sieges. Ethelred wasn't a fool nor a coward, but he became known for choosing his advisors badly, listening to the wrong advice, and he could be impulsively cruel. Year 1002 marked a change in Ethelred's reign and style under new influences as the old guard of his father's advisors died off. A certain young Shropshire thane known as Edric Struina, meaning grasper, is first mentioned at being at court, along with other family members. Even before marrying one of Ethelred's daughters and becoming Ealdorman of Mercia in 1007, Edric seems to have acted as Ethelred's enforcer. In 1002, Ethelred ordered what became known as the St. Brice's Day massacre of Danish settlers around parts of England, which is believed to have been ordered due to Ethelred's distrust of Viking mercenaries in his pay. Unfortunately for Ethelred, one of the Danish victims was none other than the sister of King Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark. Sweyn invaded England for the third time and ravaged the land, as a result of which Ethelred fled to Normandy and was replaced by Sweyn. But Sweyn only ruled until February 14. He died. Ethelred returned to rule again on condition by the English nobles that he would rule more justly, but he himself again died just within 2 years, on St. George's Day. His eldest son, Edmund, chased Sweyn's son, Canute, across England in vicious battles and bloody campaigns, earning himself a very different nickname from his father, Ironside.